You were listening to The Voice of a Father by Grayson. Chapter 10. The Media Industry. Freedom of the press is one of the rights enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution and many other countries. As a result, people often view the media as an institution. But in reality, the media is an industry. People have been conditioned to believe that the objective of the media is to inform the public about the truth, when in reality, the media industry has the same objective that every other industry has: to make money. And what is the commodity that the media industry sells to make money? It sells influence. That is what advertising is. Every time you see a commercial, it is an effort to influence. In the United States, advertising is the source of 50 to 60% of magazine revenue, 80% of newspaper revenue, and 100% of television revenue. But it is more than simply influencing the public to buy a product. To advertise is simply to say, here is a product that you should buy, and these are the reasons to buy it. But the giant industries of the world need more than that. Oil and gas, insurance, technology, banking, automotive, agriculture, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals are multi-trillion-dollar industries. Public perception sways demand. And because government officials generally do not lead, but simply react to public pressure, public perception also influences government regulations. If public pressure becomes too strong, government officials could be forced to take action that could threaten these businesses. In order to protect profits, large industries use the media as a tool to condition the thinking of the public. The oil industry has to counter efforts by environmental groups who endeavor to highlight pollution or environmental damage. It also means countering political or even commercial efforts to limit oil consumption. Food and agricultural companies need to downplay the risks of pesticides, additives, and processed foods. If they can condition people's thinking and improve public perception, it will result in less danger of profits being infringed on by government regulations. The pharmaceutical industry has to condition people to believe the medications and vaccines they produce are safe and effective. Interestingly, pharmaceutical companies are banned from advertising in Europe, Canada, Australia, and Japan. It is easy to see how advertising could skew medical decisions by causing people to demand medications they don't need based on ads that hype benefits but downplay risks. Further, in countries with socialized medicine, the government has a significant role in deciding which medications are approved and how they are priced. Advertisements for medications would interfere with that top-down decision-making. Conversely, in the United States, there is a market-driven system that allows direct consumer advertising to drive demand. If you pay attention, you will notice this type of advertising is ubiquitous in the American media, particularly the news media with its older demographic. These pharmaceutical ads often portray happy, smiling people engaged in some enjoyable activity, while a narrator reads a list of horrific side effects caused by that medication. Aside from commercial organizations, there are political activist groups and other non-government organizations. These are funded by wealthy donors who are motivated by personal and financial incentives. These organizations receive private donations, but also grants from the government. Very often, friends and relatives of well-positioned politicians find their way into these non-government organizations, or NGOs, as high-paid executives. This results in even more government funding for these groups. For those who are experts at using financial leverage, Setting up a non-government organization with a comparatively small amount of money can open the way for billions of dollars in government grants and contracts. Portions of this money is then used in the media to condition the thinking of the public to support the political views of the organization or the wealthy donors quietly behind it all. All of these competing interests have sometimes brought about unexpected results. In the Los Angeles area, smog had been notorious for decades. Public pressure rose to the point that in 1967, Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, signed legislation creating the government institution known as CARB, the California Air Quality Resources Board. This was a group of experts who would make rules in the state of California regarding air quality. Some 20 years later, in the 1980s, public concern about air quality and pollution began to create intense political pressure. Citizens and organizations began urging politicians in the state of California to take action. True to form, this public pressure resulted in government action. In 1990, the California Air Quality Resources Board established a new mandate which would require that by 1998, 2% of all cars sold in the state of California would have to be electric. By 2001, that number would have to be 5%, and by 2003, the agency required that 10% of cars sold in the state of California be electric. While on the one hand, the economy of California was too big for the auto manufacturers to ignore, on the other hand, there were two major problems with this mandate. First, the technology did not exist for 2% of vehicles sold in California to be electric. But there was an even bigger obstacle. The auto manufacturers did not want to do it. To make the change to producing electric vehicles was an existential threat for the automotive industry. They built vehicles with an internal combustion engine. To manufacture an electric vehicle was a completely different product. Like any new product, it would take many years to become profitable. They would have to forsake the billions of dollars in infrastructure they had invested in their factories and assembly lines. The car dealer model produced billions in profit by servicing and maintaining vehicles. Profits that would be lost with electric vehicles, which have no fluids or internal moving parts to replace. It would also mean losing the profit they were making selling internal combustion engine vehicles. It would force them to spend billions of dollars in developing battery technology. This was in addition to the need for what up to that point was a non-existent statewide charging system that would have to be built from the ground up. Years passed after the 1990 mandate, and by 1996, the number of electric vehicles in California was virtually zero. The oil industry, the automobile industry, together with the Auto Workers Union, funded a media campaign in an effort to sway public opinion. They lobbied heavily with the federal government to intervene. There were complaints about government overreach by unelected bureaucrats, job losses, the assertion that electric vehicles were an unproven technology and that hydrogen was actually the future. At the same time, however, the auto companies did slowly begin producing small numbers of electric vehicles for the California market, but consumers were only allowed to lease these electric vehicles, not own them. Since there was a zero likelihood of reaching the 2% electric vehicle mandate by 1998, the state of California was forced to concede and removed the 1998 2% requirement, as well as the 2001 5% requirement. But they did not want to remove the remaining 2003 requirement. As a compromise, the state of California put in place a credit system where auto companies, by producing cars with cleaner emissions, as well as hybrid vehicles, which were a combination of a battery and an internal combustion engine, would receive credits that would help them to reach a theoretical 10% electric vehicle mandate in 2003. But as the 2003 deadline approached, the auto companies sued in court and won. A federal injunction in June 2002 prevented the mandate from going into effect. The legal justification being that the state of California was attempting to regulate fuel economy, something that only the federal government had the authority to do. The auto industry and the oil industry breathed a collective sigh of relief. Car companies that had started making electric vehicles immediately stopped production. They even took back the electric vehicles they had leased to California drivers and destroyed them. The state of California had been outmaneuvered by the auto industry. To get around the federal injunction, the state removed any reference to fuel efficiency and focused on zero emissions. The credit system remained in place, with additional credits available for companies that would work on hydrogen vehicle technology. Predictably, from the court victory in 2003 until 2008, the big car companies dragged their feet and continued to build and sell gasoline-powered cars the way they always had, doing just enough with battery and hydrogen technology so as to satisfy the credit system in California. It appeared that this would be the status quo indefinitely. But in February 2008, a small startup by the name of Tesla sold its very first vehicle. A plug-in electric car called the Roadster was delivered to its CEO Elon Musk. While seemingly insignificant, this may have been the catalyst that caused the state of California to put its foot down. A month after that delivery, in March 2008, California began to significantly tighten its zero-emission vehicle requirements. By 2012, it was clear that California was going to demand thousands of plug-in electric vehicles to sell in California. While the auto companies continued to fight back in court, they built compliance vehicles, the bare minimum number of electric plug-in vehicles to satisfy the California mandate. They did not advertise these vehicles, and these companies that were obviously capable of building beautiful cars intentionally made their electric vehicles ugly and unappealing. Meanwhile, they continued to focus on building and selling the very profitable gasoline-powered cars the way they always had. Against this backdrop, from 2008 to 2012, as the big auto companies made compliance vehicles for California, Tesla continued to deliver a few thousand electric roadsters to customers. But in 2012, Tesla began to sell its first mass-market vehicle, the Model S. Tesla sold around 2,500 roadsters from 2008 to 2012. While a great accomplishment, compared to the millions of other cars on the road, it went largely unnoticed. Any attempts to create a new car company over the decades had proven to be an abject failure. The consensus among experts was that Tesla would follow that pattern. Even legendary investor Charlie Munger personally expressed to the CEO, Elon Musk, all the ways in which Tesla was likely to fail. But deliveries grew every year. In those early days, from 2012 to 2016, Tesla delivered nearly 200,000 vehicles. Press coverage was generally positive. What could possibly be bad about a company that produced non-polluting electric vehicles? But as time went on, the tone in the media began to shift. It was obvious that the big automakers were beginning to feel threatened. They were also resentful over the ever-increasing hundreds of millions of dollars they were being forced to pay Tesla in California every year to buy credits. Since they were not selling enough electric vehicles on their own, it was the only way they could satisfy the increasingly stringent zero-emission credit system in California. In 2017, Tesla began to prepare the release of its Model 3. Its previous vehicles, the Model S and the Model X, had been higher-end, expensive vehicles priced above $100,000. The Model 3 would be a much lower-priced mass-market sedan, but the release would be a Herculean feat for the company. Tesla came within weeks of bankruptcy, burning through over $100 million a week at one point. It was at this tenuous moment that an avalanche of negative stories began to appear in the media. There were personal attacks against the CEO himself, that he was crazy, that he was losing his mind, that he was lying when he reported on social media that he had found a buyer for Tesla and was considering taking the company private. There was a non-stop news stream of hit pieces about Tesla production problems, quality problems, safety problems, reports that Tesla vehicles were prone to catching fire and that the autopilot system Tesla was developing was dangerous. Although there are over 6 million traffic accidents in the United States every year, the handful that involved a Tesla, no matter how minor or trivial the circumstances, received overwhelming press coverage. Although it could not be objectively proven, it was obvious to those who understand how the world works that someone was funding a media disinformation campaign, and it was obvious who was behind it. But it wasn't just the oil and auto industry. For the first time, the media industry itself felt its influence being challenged. Tesla had notoriously refused to spend what should have been billions of dollars on advertising. Instead of giving that money to the media industry, Tesla followed a strategy of reinvesting what would have been advertising costs into their product, then using word of mouth and social media to make the public aware of its product. This posed a serious danger to the business model of the media, incentivizing journalists and editors to actively reinforce the negative narrative. But it was too late. Through great effort, the Model 3 launch was a wild success. The future of electric vehicles and the eventual extinction of the internal combustion engine had become inevitable. If you don't believe me, just keep living. Aside from the corporations and organizations that endeavor to use the media for their own purposes, the major media outlets themselves are owned and controlled by a handful of large corporations. Even what people think is their local news. Local news outlets across the United States are owned and controlled by just a handful of large conglomerates. Media corporations, like all corporations, are designed for profit. This means decisions made by media outlets about which stories to cover and how to cover them are very often motivated by their own economic interests. Executive compensation is directly tied to profitability. If profits suffer, shareholders suffer. If shareholders suffer, executive salaries will be zero because those executives will be fired. It is easy to see the media industry's incentive for sensationalizing news reports. In order to influence someone, you must first gain and then hold their attention. To accomplish that, you've probably noticed, stories that trigger fear, anger, and strong emotion receive priority. News reports focus on conflict, violence, disaster, scandal, famous people, infidelity, humiliation, and sex. Such reports are usually accompanied by dramatic, emotional, or shocking images. Those who report the news are essentially paid actors and actresses, presenting stories in a manner that is theatrical and emotionally charged. The stories are accompanied by dramatic, suspenseful music and sound effects, flashing lights and colors that go almost unnoticed. Another determining factor in whether a news story gets coverage is whether it can be presented in a way that seems easy to understand. Journalists will often exclude information that is complicated because that would introduce unresolved issues. Stories that are complicated or nuanced will either be shunned or presented only partially. As a result, some facts get exaggerated while others are minimized. Accuracy is of little consequence as long as the story can be presented in a way that gets people's attention and makes them feel like they understand it. Which news stories get major coverage and which are ignored is largely decided by a small number of senior editors and executive producers at a handful of major news outlets. These people know each other. They're often invisibly interconnected behind the scenes by who they're married to, who they're related to, who their neighbors are, who their friends are, who they socialize with, who their business associates are, who they attended university with, what country club they're a member of, what fraternity or sorority they were part of. As a result, this group largely has the same worldview and political bias. Therefore, whether someone is painted as a champion or as a villain, what behaviors are declared good or bad, what stories are covered, how much attention a story receives, what narratives are advanced, what catchwords are used, how a headline is worded, what photos or video clips are used, whether a group is filmed with a wide-angle view to make it look small or with a narrow view to make it look large, is all determined by the collective bias of this small group of elite individuals. Out of self-preservation, most editors and journalists down the chain default to that lead or risk economic destruction. Some stories have such pervasive interest that editors cannot resist the public pressure to report on them. This has especially become true with the advent of social media. Still, the power and influence wielded by this small group of people remains because there is no entity powerful enough to check them or hold them to account. Sometimes humans are dishonest. Sometimes humans make mistakes. Sometimes humans make assumptions. Because the media industry is run by humans, sometimes there is dishonesty, sometimes there are mistakes, and very often there are assumptions. There are many examples of journalists fabricating stories. In 1989, an article was published in a Japanese newspaper about coral damage in Okinawa. The article claimed that the coral reef had been defaced. Upon investigation, it was found that the journalist who reported the story made the scratches in the coral himself, manufacturing damage to create a more sensational story. An especially common way of manifesting dishonesty in recent years is by splicing video or editing a speech to make it appear a speaker was saying something he or she was not. Fake news stories often have unnamed or unverified sources who are said to have exclusive information. Mistakes in reporting are exceedingly easy because humans make mistakes. But competition within the industry to be the first to report an event creates a motivation for publishing inaccurate information. In the world of news reporting, being wrong will be forgiven, being late will not. As for assumptions, the media generally does well when it comes to reporting the what in a story. What were the observable, verifiable events? A sports team won a championship. A political candidate won an election, or the stock market went down. But the same cannot be said about the media's coverage as to why an event transpired. Why did that team win? Why did that candidate win the election? Why did the stock market go down? Very often, those reasons are not clearly known and cannot be known for a certainty. But because that answer would not be satisfactory to their consumers, a causal story must be presented, even if it is nothing more than the confirmation bias of the journalist writing the article and the editor who approved it, even if it confuses correlation and causation. For example, statistics show that people who take more vacations live longer. So, are vacations good for your health? Or do wealthy people who can afford vacations have access to better information, diet, and medical care? Statistics show that there is a correlation between depression and looking at screens. So, does looking at screens cause depression? Or do depressed people spend more time looking at screens? There are endless examples. But what is reported as the cause of an event depends totally on the assumptions of the human who wrote the article. Consider what is called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. Murray Gell-Mann was a renowned physicist. He actually won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1969. Gell-Mann noticed that when he read stories in the newspaper about physics, those stories would be full of inaccuracies and misunderstandings. But then he would turn the page in the paper and read another article on politics or a subject that he did not know well. Yet he would assume that information was accurate. Thus the term amnesia effect, forgetting to apply the logic that if there were inaccuracies in the subject that he understood well, there were likely inaccuracies in the stories about subjects he did not know well. Famous people who read stories about themselves in the media know this to be true. Experts in any given field also know this to be true when the media discusses their area of expertise. But remarkably, the amnesia effect kicks in for almost all of them. What made Dr. Gell-Mann different was that he had enough self-awareness to notice it, while most people do not. Not to be overlooked is the influence of governments on the media. When radio and television were new, the United States government established agencies like the Federal Communications Commission to provide licenses for over-the-air broadcasting. So, not only did the patriotism of media executives motivate them to provide pro-government or pro-war programming, but there was a financial incentive as well. The government had the ability to pull those licenses and put any media company out of business immediately if they did not cooperate. Newspapers would be provided with premium payment by the government for printing war bond ads. Failing to do so would mean missing out on huge amounts of revenue. There would also be the risk or even the threat of boycotts or public backlash. The government passed laws like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act that allowed federal forces to prosecute newspapers and editors who took an anti-war stance. Paper was one of the many products that were rationed during World War II. If a newspaper did not cooperate with the government's messaging, it would suddenly find itself unable to buy paper. After World War II, the United States and other Western countries still needed to be able to influence the media. But during the Cold War, while trying to distinguish itself from the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, Western nations could not so readily employ blunt force. Of course, it would be hopelessly naive to believe that Western governments could not or would not bully, threaten, coerce, or do whatever was deemed necessary to force compliance for the sake of national security. But in most cases, covert government organizations would use highly sophisticated tactics that almost no one would be aware of. Modern technology has added an additional layer of complexity. In years past, radio and television companies would put out programming and then have to wait for feedback on how it was being digested by the public. Such information would be based on surveys and other spotty forms of measuring audience engagement. But today, with the internet and the advent of artificial intelligence, news media companies are able to put out content and then immediately measure in real time how it is being digested by their audience. When they find that a story gains momentum, usually because it is fear inspiring or emotionally triggering, they focus on those stories and put out more of them. Whether intentional or not, the result is a perpetual state of anxiety among those who consume their product. The world is currently in a transition period where social media is beginning to exercise influence on the media industry, forcing journalists and editors to cover stories they would have previously had the latitude to ignore or minimize. It will be interesting to see how that relationship evolves.